Hi everyone, I'm Adam Dede and welcome to Neurojournal Club. Now before we get started, just quick shopkeeping stuff. Please subscribe, like the video, share it if you're feeling it, and click on the link below to support me on Patreon to try and keep me fed, safe, and happy here as I'm stuck in Nepal. Cool. Alright, so what are we going to talk about today? So today we're going to talk about, can meditation improve your attention? So same topic as last time, but hopefully we're going to be able to address some of the limitations that the study we talked about last time wasn't able to get. So what were those limitations? So first, the meditators in the study that we looked at last time from Van Leeuwen, and I should say last video I was saying Leeuwen. The first author of the paper that we talked about last time was actually Van Leeuwen. Sorry for that mix-up. But in any case, the meditators in that study were not randomly assigned. So this was an issue. They had variable types of meditation practice. Not everyone was doing the same type of meditation. And it'd be really nice to measure over time. So are these limitations really very important? So let's discuss them each one at a time. So first, the importance of random assignment. Now, as an example here, I'm going to talk about how ice cream doesn't cause murder. Now, that might seem obvious. Ice cream doesn't cause murder. But it turns out that ice cream sales and murder rates are actually really well correlated. The more ice cream that's sold, the more murders happen. Now, don't worry, you can still go get your Haagen-Dazs or your Ben & Jerry's, because there's a third factor here that we're not considering, and that's heat. It turns out that the hotter it is, the more likely there are to be murders, and also the hotter it is, the more likely it is that people go buy ice cream. So ice cream doesn't have anything to do causally with murder. It just turns out that there's this third variable, heat, which seems to have some causal influence on both of them. Similarly, we might imagine that in meditation, the type of person who decides that what they want to do is go and sit on their own with their eyes closed is not necessarily the same as the type of person who doesn't want to do that. And maybe the differences between these types of people are the differences that we pick up in studies measuring attention and other cognitive factors, rather than there actually being some difference caused by the meditation. So in an ideal world, what we'd want to do is take random people and assign them either to meditate or not to meditate, and then see what the difference is. Another issue that went on in the Van Leeuwen study was that there were different types of meditation being practiced by the different people in the study. Now, is that really an issue? This is something that we can get into more in future videos, but just very briefly here, let me show you some results from Manna, Raffone, and Romani. On the left side of the screen, what we're seeing is a decrease in activation in the posterior cingulate area of the brain associated with focused attention meditation. On the right side, what we're looking at is increases in activation associated with open monitoring meditation, and we can see that in the anterior cingulate and then also in the anterior pole of the frontal lobe. So these differences in brain activation are something that'll take a lot of unpacking to interpret what they really mean. But the key thing here is that a different type of meditation, open monitoring versus focused attention meditation, results in a different type of brain activation. So we might imagine that they might also result in different types of cognitive results. Because of this, it gets difficult to interpret any study where the meditation condition involves different types of meditation. So another thing that the Van Leeuwen study was unable to do was to measure longitudinally. And it might be nice because looking at the same participants over time can help make causal claims. So to understand why this is, just think about it logically. If we measure people who meditate and people who don't meditate, and we see some difference, it's hard to tell why that difference occurred for all the reasons that we just talked about. But if we measure people who meditate and people who don't meditate, and then we measure that same group of people after the meditators have done a bunch of meditation and the non-meditators have not done any meditation, and we see that the meditators have changed where the non-meditators have not changed, then we can say, oh, well, the difference in the time period between the observations was that one group meditated and one group didn't, so therefore the meditation is at least somewhat likely to have had a causal role in the change that we observed. So now if you didn't watch the last video, I'm just going to do a quick review. How can we measure attention? So we're going to be looking at the attentional blink. Now, like I said last time, the attentional blink has nothing to do with actually blinking your eyes, This is the idea that when stimuli are presented to you, even when you see them with your eyes open, sometimes your attention will be absorbed with something else, and you won't see a stimulus that's right in front of you. Effectively, your attention blinks rather than your eyes. So in the study we're going to look at today by Slagter, Lutz, and Davidson from 2007, they did something very, very similar to the study by Van Leeuwen that we looked at last time. Letters were presented in rapid serial visual presentation, so one letter after another, very, very quickly. And interspersed amongst those letters, there were two numbers. And the participant's task was to report what was the first number, what was the second number. So, who to study? So in this study, they looked at meditators before and after a 3-month Vipassana retreat. So that's a really long time to just sit and do the same day over and over and over. 3 months of 10 to 12 hours a day of meditation, every day, exactly the same routine. And then they looked at non-meditators before and after just a 3-month period. So, results. So first, in the Slagter study that we're looking at today, they didn't really look at the identification of the first number, and that's because, as we're seeing here, just rehashing the results from Van Leeuwen that we looked at last time, identifying the first number is pretty easy. So everyone is great at it. They all get 90% plus, doesn't matter what the lag is. So on this x-axis here, we're looking at the lag, that number of distractor items between the first number and the second number, and it turns out that doesn't really have a big effect on whether or not the participant identifies the first number. So it's really that second number that's interesting when we're talking about the attentional blink. And the idea here is that the participant is absorbed with processing the first number, and so their attention blinks, and they miss that second number. And we can see that here looking at the results again from Van Leeuwen that we reviewed last time, that when you're trying to identify the second number, there's this fall off in performance when there's a lag 2 item, so that's where there's one distractor between the first target and the second target. We see this dramatic fall off in the performance of these young controls. But the meditators didn't show such a fall off, just to review the Van Leeuwen finding. Now, here, the Slagter study, which is what we're going to talk about today, they chose just 2 different time points. So they're looking at either a lag 3 or at a lag 7, and they're not considering any of these other possible points along this curve. They're just going to look at this point and this point. They're going to call this one their short interval, and they're going to call this one their long interval. So let's take a look at their results. So first, let's look at the short interval. So this is the interval where we should be kind of within that attentional blink. And what we're looking at here are the novices on the left, so these are the participants who didn't meditate, and the meditators on the right. And what we can see is that as we move from the initial test to the test at 3 months out, the novices do improve. They go from about 60% correct to about 70% correct on identifying that second number. That's the key one that happens during the attentional blink. But the meditators, they seem to show a larger improvement. They go from also about 60% at the start up to about 80%. So they get this bigger improvement than do the novices. And then what about the long interval? So the long interval, we wouldn't really expect there to be a big difference, because this is something that's happening outside the attentional blink when the participants have had plenty of time to recover from processing that first item before the second item comes up. And what we can see here is that, first of all, everyone does a lot better at the long interval items than they did at the short interval items. And people do improve, but their improvement seems to be more modest than it was on the short interval. And maybe that's because they're already kind of at ceiling. They're already kind of doing as well as they can possibly do. So just to break this down numerically, let's take a look at the change across 3 months. So for the novices, in the short lag, they improved by 9%, and in the long lag, they improved by 7%. The meditators, though, in the short lag, they improved by 20%, so that's pretty big. And then in the long lag, they improved by 11%. So what we can see is that across conditions, everyone improves by about 10% on all conditions, with the notable exception that meditators in that short lag condition, so that lag that's occurring during the attentional blink, when you would think they would still be engaged processing the first number and the second number comes at them, but they manage to improve by a full 20% across this 3-month time period with intense meditation. So let's see what conclusions we can draw. So the meditators got better at something that they didn't even train for. So now, unlike last time where it was really that the meditators just were better at something that they didn't train for, here we can actually say the meditators got better at something that they didn't even train for. Since we had that ability to look at their performance from one time point to another time point, we can actually see that improvement. So that's pretty cool. And this effect is very basic. So just to emphasize this point that we made in the last video, this is really showing that the meditators are changing the way that they interact with the environment in a very moment-to-moment way, which is pretty cool. Now, some limitations. These are the limitations that we talked about from the Van Leeuwen study, and let's see how well we address them. So the meditators were not randomly assigned. Now that's still true here. You can't really randomly assign someone to spend 3 months doing 10 hours of meditation a day and taking a vow of silence. It's just not going to really work out very well. Now, the variable meditation practice, though, was controlled for. Everyone did exactly the same meditation. So we know that that aspect of this study was controlled. And it'd be nice to measure over time. Now, we did that. So that aspect of the study was controlled for as well. We could actually see the change from one time point to another time point. So one limitation, though. What about more lags? Why did they only measure at these 2 locations? Now, it turns out further that they actually didn't even do exactly the same paradigm that Van Leeuwen did. Now, notice that the Slagter study came out in 2007, the Van Leeuwen study came out in 2009, so this is nobody failing to replicate anybody else. This is just a reflection of the fact that this attentional blink literature is actually really big, and there's a lot of different ways that you might measure it. So, to think about these lags, though, why pick these lags? As we can see in the Van Leeuwen data, and again, this is just one example set of data, it seems like really you'd want to measure at that lag 2 rather than further out. At lag 2, that seems to be where the biggest deficit really occurs. So that would be where you'd want to see the effects of meditation and really take a look at it. So why did they choose this? Now, I'm not exactly sure, but one thing to keep in mind is that there were differences in how the study was run. The first number was not red, where in the Van Leeuwen study it was red, which would make it pop out at you, and that might change the dynamics of the task, you could imagine. And then another difference here was that in the Van Leeuwen study, each letter or number was on the screen for 100 milliseconds, whereas in the Slagter study that we looked at today, each stimulus was on the screen for only 50 milliseconds, plus a 34 millisecond gap of blank space between characters. Now, how that change in the presentation time might affect the study, I'm not really sure, but these are differences that it's important to keep in mind. Okay, so let's just loop back to conclusions real quick to give you some take-home points. So first, the meditators got better at something that they didn't even train for, which is really cool, showing us this effect of transfer that perhaps meditation is allowing people to gain some kind of broad spectrum increase in abilities, which would be really super cool. And the effect is very basic. It's changing the way that people are interacting with the world on a moment-by-moment basis, which suggests that maybe it really is fundamentally changing who they are in some kind of core way. So, pretty cool. And then let's just talk really quickly about what are some questions for the future. So one thing I'm wondering about here is what is the brain doing in all of this? And it actually turns out that Slagter, Lutz, and Davidson, this 2007 study we've been talking about, they actually did do some measures of the brain. So we're going to talk about that in the next video. And does the type of meditation matter? So we talked a little bit today about differences in brain activation with different types of meditation and how it's this confound that needs to be watched out for. But does it actually matter? Does the type of meditation that someone does actually change the effects that they get as a result of the meditation? So that's something we'll look at in future videos. And then how do method differences affect the attentional blink? So we talked a little bit today about how the Slagter study and the Van Leeuwen study had some subtle but maybe important differences in the way that they elicited the attentional blink. So it's going to be interesting to take a look at more nitty-gritty. How is it that these little differences in how you present stimuli might change the way that your attention deals with those stimuli? All right, cool. So that's our video for today. If you liked it, please click the thumbs up. If you want to subscribe and see more of these videos, try and answer some of these future questions, please go ahead and subscribe. And if you feel like you have the means, please click the Patreon link below to support me here in Nepal and keep these videos coming. All right, cool, thanks, and I'll see you next time.